Welcome to the Prime Property Finance Podcast with Gareth Morgan and Mark Watts. This unique podcast will dive deep into all areas of property investing finance, going behind the scenes with property professionals, investors and clients. Between us, we have 35 plus years experience in property finance. The podcast has been launched to share knowledge, mindset requirements and experiences of successful investors and professionals. We aim to simplify many of the complicated areas of finance and investing and provide valuable and easy to implement tips. Keep an eye out for our new longer episodes every Tuesday and our shorter ones every Friday. Welcome to this week's episode of the Prime Property Finance Podcast with myself, Gareth Morgan and Mark Watts. And this week we're talking about the Renters Reform Bill. So you've spent years building your rental portfolio, and now you're hearing about eviction bans, stricter energy rules, lenders tightening up on landlord criteria. It feels like the rug has been pulled from underneath you. But what if you knew exactly how the Renters Reform Bill could impact you and your finance options, and how to prepare so you don't get caught out later on? In this episode, we're talking about the Renters Reform Bill and what it really means for mortgages, portfolio planning and future borrowing. If you're a landlord, this one's not just important, it's essential. So let's dive straight in. Welcome, Mark, to this most recent episode of the Prime Property Finance Podcast. Let's get the elephant out of the room. What's going on with the tash?
Well, my attempt to grow a moustache, is it? At the start November in July.
Yeah, you had a head start. Yeah. No, obviously it's really important to raise awareness for men's health and making sure that people do get themselves checked out. And it is, whilst we have a laugh and a joke about it, it is a really serious topic, and there's thousands of men affected by this every sort of year. So we just wanted to take that opportunity to bring it to light again and have some fun with it along the way. So yeah,
absolutely.
If you see us walking around looking silly, then that'll be why.
No different to usual.
No, absolutely. All right, should we get into this week's episode?
Yeah, indeed.
So this week we are talking about the upcoming Renters Reform Bill. Obviously, it's now gained royal assent with the government, and so it's going to happen. And so all of the conversations about whether it would come in, it was always a case of when, not if. But now that it certainly is, it's now a case of when exactly is it going to come in. Hopefully there'll be a bit of leeway before its approval, before its acceptance, and they're not going to just make it overnight thing, and they'll give us some line of sight as to when it does actually come in. Obviously, the Renters' Rights Bill does only impact England. Wales already has Rent Smart Wales, and that's been in place for about 6 years now. Scotland has been through its own version, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that later on. So this does only impact landlords and tenancies in England, but obviously it's all over the press, and we're not going to deep dive too much about the impacts on you, particularly as a landlord, or we're going to cover some of the high level topics, but how they impact things from a financial aspect and getting mortgages and things.
It's a topic that's had a lot of airtime, positive and negative. There's been a lot of rhetoric around it as well, a lot of scaremongering with some of it that's come along. And we could spend hours, no doubt, talking about it. So just to echo really, that we thought we would come at this specifically from a finance perspective, being finance brokers, and just see how we anticipate some of these changes will impact the ability or the challenges to get mortgages in the future.
Yeah, that's it. And so, some of these changes ultimately could affect your ability to borrow, your ability to refinance or hold on to your properties. So that, the stakes have been raised effectively, which is great in some respects, because ultimately what this whole idea around is trying to get rid of rogue landlords, and it's trying to professionalize the industry. And as far as we're concerned, that's a good thing, because, everyone is on board and everyone knows what to expect. I guess the challenge for landlords at the moment and for lenders is that lenders don't particularly like uncertainty. So as the Big Hill Bill becomes law, they'll respond with tighter affordability, stricter stress testing, potentially more cautious underwriting. So criteria would change, and And we won't know what that is until lenders start to implement those changes. And so, I guess that the head-in really is to just don't expect things not to change, because they will. And so making sure you've got a plan for that. And we'll cover some of those off shortly. And I guess the point being for this in terms of relevance is now, we know it's coming. So before it is implemented, the key message is that, being on top of it, being proactive as a landlord and an investor to make sure that, if you might want to get some refinancing done prior to implementation, just to make that easier for you. And it's just staying ahead of the curve really, and making sure that your knowledge is up to speed for what comes in. And that, that impacts any landlord, whether it's single let, HMO's growing portfolio, but anyone that's looking to finance in 2026 or beyond, especially those with older tenancy agreements or lower EPCs, will definitely be impacted. So, I guess let's dive into some of these challenges then. So should we just cover off some of the key items that are going to be brought in? One of the first ones being the end of Section 21 no-fault evictions. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yep. So the bill has got multiple things in it, but there were a few that stood out, I think, would have what everybody believes to be the greatest impact on being a landlord, and some of the biggest changes. So the end of Section 21, no-fault evictions, as they were otherwise known, is the ability to, or previously the ability to issue or to regain possession of your property without a specific reason as such, hence the no-fault eviction. So there was a notice period, and let's say you wanted to move back in it in the next few months, you could issue the relevant notice, and then they would vacate the premises, and then you could move back in or something like that. So that was the idea behind it. Obviously, the government must have felt that meant that there was a degree of uncertainty for tenants. And I'm sure that was abused at by some landlords. There's two sides or three sides to every story. The landlords, the tenants, and probably the truth straight down the middle. So that's now being taken away. But what does that actually mean? Well, that means it's now that much more difficult to get possession of your property. And specifically from the conversation from the standpoint of finance will be if that tenant ceases to pay the rent any further. So what we would otherwise refer to as void periods, where you're not getting the income off the property, but you've still got your financial commitments. That is highly likely to have a bearing on what the financial pressure it could put on you as a landlord if you've got a tenant who's particularly difficult, ceases to pay, and then the process of getting control of that property or evicting them is going to be much more drawn out, given the current process. And also there was a promise, I believe, at the time of this that they were going to refine or review the court process. But as always, these things I don't think have coincided and haven't happened at the same time. So this has come in, and the courts are probably going to struggle to deal with the new process and the volume that's associated with it. And that's just going to put some additional pressure on landlords financially.
What it looks like is, in terms of those evictions, if it does go to a tribunal, you can almost kiss goodbye to 12 months of waiting. And so if you want, so that brings in a massive risk to landlords, because one, if they haven't got a tenant paying and they are paying the mortgage and they can't gain possession, then means that, cash flow is going to be squeezed, and one something we'll talk about later on is buffers and making sure that there's money set aside in case these things do happen. So yeah, that's got some big potential consequences.
On that then, so who's it most likely to impact when you think about the implications of this? So I think those people who are accidental landlords have got one property. So when you've got one property and you couldn't afford the mortgage if it wasn't occupied through your earnings, your salaries, if you can't carry that, they're probably the people who are carrying the most risk in this scenario. Your portfolio landlords, you'd argue, the risk is spread. Therefore, if you've got, say, 10 or more properties, you're more likely to be able to carry the cost of a vacant property through the profit, if you like, of the other properties. So the ones that really need to pay attention to this part, I think, are going to be those accidental landlords that are perhaps got not a particularly high income, or they're, even if they have got a high income, they might have high overheads as well. So the question to be asking yourself at this point is, could you afford to continue to make payments to that mortgage for a 12-month period if you were to unfortunately get a tenant that was difficult and wouldn't pay? And I guess that's the question you want to be asking yourself. And if the answer to that is no, you probably want to have a look at your financial resilience going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so I think you're 100% spot on the impact on those people with a single property. So they've inherited it, or maybe they've kept their first property and then moved up the ladder and rented that one out. Those people are the ones who are going to be affected the most. But I also think the rogue landlords as well, where people are trying to, they don't do any work on their properties. They just chuck people in there. They charge them, this is all where the landlords get a bad name on those properties with poor condition, which is one of the things that the bill will bring in anyway. So it's driving up standards and making things more professional in terms of the space. So you will see just more lower landlords and unprofessional landlords leave the market, and then just professionalizing and making it more business-like in terms of the ones that remain. So yeah, absolutely. One of the other key changes is the scrapping of fixed-term tenancies. So it basically will be rolling open-ended tenancies. Tenants will be able to leave with 2 months' notice, while landlords must use the Section 8 process to end the tenancies. So not quite a fair term in that sense. So it's definitely favoured towards the tenant. One of the areas which we think this could be affected is around students and student HMOs. How do you see that affecting landlords and finance?
Yeah, so the student market is a very well established one. There's a lot of, especially if you're in a university city, HMOs are quite appealing, and they suit the student lifestyle. So they want, low cost communal living, I guess, or relatively low cost communal living. So that works quite nicely there. Obviously, the fixed period refers to terms and the academic year. So not everybody will want to have, you'll tend to occupy that HMO or your room, if you like, for that particular academic year with a view of moving on possibly to other accommodation or leaving or whatever that may be. On the basis there are 11 months is a cheaper alternative to having to make a full 12-month commitment as well. So that's going to impact that space on the basis that my understanding of it is it draws some uncertainty to end of term. Now, you as the landlord want to know that that property is going to be vacated so that you can bring in the next student for the next academic year. Now, if you don't have a fixed period and the student decides not to leave as per your arrangement, and you then have to follow the Section 8 process, then you clearly can't market that property to be occupied by another student. And with a couple of landlords that I know, we've got student properties, they start marketing theirs in sort of the June time, ready for September. So, they're taking away that end date just produces a degree of uncertainty that just makes it far less appealing, which is interesting when you consider how much PBSA, purpose-built student accommodation, is going on out there.
Well, I think looking at the rules, that there will be for purpose-built accommodation, there will be a slightly different rule, which goes against probably the more professional landlords and institutional investors. So one rule for them and another rule for private landlords. Quelle surprise, right?
Indeed.
And the other thing on that is the actual period where landlords will tend to do it it's usually an 11-month tenancy, and they leave 1 month in order to get in and make repairs and refurb the property ready for the next academic year. And so that might become a challenge also, because I know they always tend to line those up quick turnaround before the next lot of academic students come in. So yeah, watch this space, I would say, and let's see what happens on that one.
It'll be interesting to see how lenders will shift their underwriting policies around, so many lenders will have specific student-let policy criteria and policies that we need to adhere to. So it'll be interesting to see how they sort of deal with that, basically. And I don't kind of know how they go into it unless they're just totally removed from the market.
Yeah. So another one then, moving on, is rental increases restricted. So landlords will only be able to raise rents once a year and serve a formal Section 13 notice, given at least 2 months' notice. And then tenants will be allowed to challenge increases of rents at the tribunal if they think they're above a market rate. So, this is going to impact, obviously, landlords because, as their deals come to an end, then, it could affect their stress testing on the affordability. Fixed rates come to an end, some coming off higher. There are still some landlords on very low interest rates. And if they haven't been putting the rents up, then this is potentially a challenge for them. What are the risks you see there?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And I think actually this is going to push something to the forefront of the landlord's mind, which I don't think has been there for a number of years. So Liz Truss's mini budget or statement when everything went awry with the interest rates, we were in a very stable scenario of low interest rates and so on. And historically, landlords didn't increase their rents. They were quite happy. There's an argument over, do I increase the rent and upset the tenant, or is there more value in a good tenant versus squeezing an extra 20 quid a month out and etc. And that's that's a topic for another day. However, with the now volatility in interest rates, people who didn't make those increases obviously felt it really tough when it got to the stage that they needed to refinance and the rental income wasn't enough then to service the mortgage at the much higher rate. Now, that in itself is a problem, but I also think personally it's a bit unfair. You're actually setting the tenant up to fail if you don't make incremental increases. So as we all know, if you put your bills up by 5% per annum, then that's far less painful than trying to put it up by 30% and make one big step in 5 years' time. And it becomes more of the norm. The other thing that I think happens there as well is that the tenant is in a property that if they were to replace that with a different property, they couldn't get into that level because the market has since moved on. So I think this one makes a lot of sense in so much that incremental increases are required. You can't make that jump. Well, it's better for everyone all told. It's more affordable for the tenant, and you as the landlord can stay on top of it, making your decisions on that front. The bit I think that has got the sting in the tail with this is the ability to challenge through tribunal. Now, whilst I understand there always needs to be balance in these arguments, what you don't want is punitive challenges just to slow down and bog down the process. So it's going to be incumbent on the landlord to do your homework. You want to be having a look at comparable market rates, your justification. I would even go as far as to say, you may want to offer the tenant the ability to re-evidence their affordability again so that you can be seen to be making a sound decision. And it's not just, so what they're trying to combat is people going, we'll just whack it up to market rate and it's almost double what it needs to be. And then it's putting tenants under financial pressure. So that's what tenants need to be doing in the back of that. If they do it properly, as it should be done, then this shouldn't really be that much of an issue. As I say, but the challenges bit is probably the bit that, and there was something you said that was quite frightening around the panel. So you said about the number of people that can review this tribunal or something?
So apparently my understanding of what I heard was that if it does go to tribunal, then there is only about 5 judges that's going to be working these tribunals across the whole of the country. So if you can imagine, if you put yourself in a tenant's shoes, why would you not push it to tribunal? So if your landlord wants to put the rent up, you just go tribunal, and then that kind of news will spread like wildfire across Facebook groups and social media and whatever else. And so people will put in for a tribunal. 5 judges all over the country looking at these. You look at 12 months, easy, if not longer, before that tribunal gets heard. And so you'll come to the point where you're ready to put your next lot of rent up, and that could affect ultimately stress testing and profit margins within the portfolio. Okay, so yeah, that's an interesting one, definitely to keep an eye on, and where cash flow, ultimately where you're looking at your cash flow for your portfolio. And then sort of raising standards, so the decent homes to Awab's law. So there's a decent home standard. So that'll come in and that'll apply to private rentals, requiring homes to be safe, warm and free from serious hazards such as damp or mould. Landlords will have a legal duty to meet the standard with penalties for non-compliance. Awab's law adds strict legal timelines for investigating and repairing serious issues once reported. So ultimately, this goes on to talk about the standard of the property, and again, what we talked about earlier around raising standards. I think there's too many landlords have just kind of brushed things under the carpet and just not let things. My concern for this is some of the condition of the properties is affected by tenants' behaviour. And I think as long as there's a fair reflection, and I've experienced this myself with tenants drying clothes over radiators and not having airflow in the property and things like that. And so if they don't manage the property well, that can backfire on the landlord. And I think there just needs to be some sensible behaviour around how that's monitored. But obviously, there have been instances where landlords have done nothing and it is their fault. And obviously, obviously passed away based on some of those instances. So it's serious if neglected, and so the punishment should be serious as well. And so again, all we're doing is driving up standards. Now, how does that affect financing? I think valuations will potentially be stricter. So when mortgage lenders are carrying out valuations on both purchases and we've seen this already come in on purchases, whereas in the past, when you're buying a buy-to-let property or getting a mortgage on a property, is the property mortgageable would be the sort of question. And over recent years, that shift has gone. The question's not anymore, is the property mortgageable? The question is now, is the property lettable in its current condition? And so that will drive up standards, and buy-to-let lenders won't lend on properties that aren't already. So if there's any signs of damp or mold or things like that, or if it doesn't have a good EPC rating and things, then they just won't lend. And so the option for landlords will be to go and buy it in cash and do it up, or use bridging finance to do it up and then refinance once the standard's increased. But that can only be a good thing as well. One, from a standards perspective, but two, from a landlord's long-term, portfolio strength perspective as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think the other thing to consider there is obviously the way that the tenant manages the property, but very much whether they actually report it in the first instance. So we've just gone through a case with the client now where we're doing a simple product transfer. It should be simple, but the lender needs to revalue the property physically rather than rely on a desktop valuation. That means that it's been inspected and they've identified some damp. Now, whether that's through fault of the landlord or the tenant is to be debated, but it's evident the landlord now has to go give a damp and timber report to show the extent of that damp. And, it's going to cost them a few £1,000s to get that resolved going forward. Now, there's a counter argument that if the tenant had reported that soon enough, it didn't have to get to this point in the first instance. So it's delayed the product transfer. So they've sat on the standard variable rate for a few months longer whilst they've been resolving the problem. So we are starting to see some of this find its way into refinances and stuff of that nature. Now, most lenders rely on desktop valuations when it comes to refinancing doing product switches. But, on evidence of this particular one, we may potentially see more of that, because there's probably going to be a responsibility on the lender to a degree to make sure that the properties they're lending against are suitable for, tenants to inhabit.
100%. And I had this with a tenant. We had a tenant in one of our properties. When the tenant eventually left, we were going to put the property on the market. When I went to see the property, it was in a horrendous condition. And I could not believe the condition of the property, how it got that bad. Clearly, the letting agent was not doing the inspections, because they weren't being reported, because all of the back of the house had ivy on it, which was never there before. It was all over the back of the house. It was penetrating through the window. There was damp everywhere. It was horrendous. And I had never seen the property in that condition before. It was being managed. As far as I was concerned, there was no issues. They hadn't highlighted anything to me that there were any issues. And so just because you've got a letting agent, just making sure that the letting agent's doing their job as well. So, and again, ultimately I have to hold my hand up and be more responsible to say, well, I wasn't getting any inspections, or, if the property is being inspected, are you having a report? And are you following up to make sure that you have those reports? So ultimately, the buck stops with you as the landlord and not with the letting agent. So again, this will be something that'll fall into it. And that leads nicely on to the next point as well, is that landlords will be listed on a government website and ultimately will be held accountable. And so this is an issue, and we've had this in Wales with Rent Smart Wales. So I think Rent Smart Wales has been in for about 6 years now. So they trialled it probably in Wales and in Scotland before they did in England, and rolled it out. And you will go onto a national register which is open public forum. But ultimately, you can get banned as a landlord. And so if you get banned as a landlord and you can't get a certificate to say that, approved by Rent Smart Wales in this instance, then you're banned from being a landlord. You can't be a landlord. And so if you've got 20 properties and you're banned from being a landlord, it's illegal for you to rent them out. And so that creates a headache. So there's a big onus on the landlord to make sure that the properties are good. So you definitely need to increase your systems and processes to make sure that you don't fall foul of that.
Yeah. And the flip side to that, and we've seen this again with the Rent Smart Wales. So, we've lived this experience for some time now. And whilst, it's far from perfect, I think they would admit that themselves. There's things that can be done better. But, for new landlords and for existing ones, just to remind you of your responsibilities, so there's been some criticism around Rent Smart Wales in Wales. However, it's very prescribed, so you cannot turn around and say you didn't know what you should and shouldn't be doing, because it's all written there in text. You go through a training exercise when you become registered, you go through a program, and it's very clear what the expectations are on you. So I think that is a good thing, as much as it may be deemed as a nuisance for experienced landlords and know what I'm doing and that sort of stuff. But legislation changes, and not every, it's tough to stay up to date with all the different legislation changes in the first instance. So I think this is a great thing. It gives transparency around who landlords are and who the ultimate responsibility sits with. And from a tenant's perspective, you can quickly do a search on a database before you inhabit a property. If they're not registered with the program or whatever it's going to be called when it goes live, then you know that you're probably stepping into the relationship you don't want to at that stage. I do caveat that quite heavily, in so much as in the early days, it depends how they roll this out, I think, is probably more important. If you've just got a cliff edge, everybody needs to be on by this date, that's going to cause a problem. If you roll it out sensibly with a good program of educating and getting people listed, hopefully that won't be an issue, because mortgage lenders will check that database. And if you're not on there, you can't have a mortgage, or you can't do your refinance, or you'll be in breach of your terms and conditions of your existing mortgage because you haven't kept up with your legal responsibilities as a landlord. So it can cause problems, but if delivered in the right way, I think will be a positive.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that kind of just in a nutshell sums up those changes that are coming, that we see the biggest ones that will impact, the mortgage market and landlords. So I guess just moving on to kind of just understanding how this impacts in more detail your mortgages and your exit strategies potentially moving forward. I think if you're in a fixed rate and that's going to be coming to an end in the next, probably in 2026 and beyond, and you're planning to refinance, you might want to change lender, you might want to raise money. Effectively, you're going to probably need a new valuation done. And so all of these things that we've just considered are going to affect that. And so lenders are going to adjust, or are not going to, they may adjust stress tests, they may adjust loan to values. So if you're at 75, they might bring that down to 70 or 65 to protect themselves. Attitude for an appetite for HMOs and flats, depending on some of the new risks that are coming in, might change. So I guess the key thing is not assuming that today's lending rules will still apply in 12 months' time.
Absolutely. And whilst we can't control any of this, there's that saying, is it manage the manageables? What I guess people need to do is just to make themselves a little more resilient, financially robust, to help with these sorts of things. awareness is key. Being aware of it is the first part to any problem before you start to try and solve it. So, many landlords won't touch them, as in it will not cause them a problem from mortgages. There will be others out there where it does. So yeah, having your eyes wide open, I think, is the main thing. And it remains to be seen, I think, from what lenders will do from a criteria perspective to try and mitigate their risk. At this stage, it's speculation. What's interesting is the different lenders and what they perceive to be the problems. And it differs on which lender you speak to. So I don't think there's a consensus on that yet. So, it remains to be seen how this is actually going to find its way into the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So then the next one we have is obviously checking sort of your EPC rating, because we're very aware of the MEES, the minimum energy efficiency standards that are going to be coming in. And so that's probably another topic. We've covered it off already, EPCs and the future and the Green Deal and the green agenda. But this is talked about again. And it's not just checking the EPC rating, it's also checking the condition of the property based on what we've just said. Effectively, criteria around quality is going to change for the better, but that could face anything with below a C could face both lower limits, could increase conversion costs, because it's quite difficult to get some properties up one or two bandings within EPC ratings if they're old properties or if they only have a single supplier of electric or gas or whatever it may be. So yeah, I think it's just watch that space and start strategizing and planning out for your portfolio. If you've got a portfolio, reviewing the current EPC ratings across the board and looking into, there are some tools out there that you can, and we can put in the link of the show notes, a tool that you can go through to assess your property based on its current standards, and it'll give you some pointers on the costs of some works that you can do on some retrofitting. So that'll be a good tool to use and a worthwhile exercise to run through on your portfolio.
Yeah, and it's a difficult one for landlords, this, I think, in so much that the rules haven't been set out yet. So I know there are some landlords that are proactively seeking to make these adjustments to their properties, knowing that EPCC and above is going to be a thing. And we've heard some dates banded about, and then they've been pushed back and so on and so forth. But then there's a lot of landlords that are sitting back and going, well, I don't actually know what I'm aiming for. Therefore, I don't want to go spending 15, 20, whatever the figure is, thousands of pounds, and then miss the target anyway.
Well, the biggest problem with all of this is that the government may change EPCs. So EPCs might not even be a thing in the future. And so they might just rewrite the whole playbook, in which case those landlords are probably the ones doing it right and just sitting tight. So it doesn't help when you haven't got certainty of what the future looks like. So yeah, again, I think this is one that we just watch this space, but making people aware of what's likely to come in place.
Yeah, the cynic of me this will be a paper exercise. It'll change the rating scale so that probably 75% of the properties that are a D will just automatically become a C. And then that's the silver bullet that will change that will make us look good on paper, but not actually have changed anything.
Yeah, and ultimately, I've talked about this on other podcasts, episodes with various guests around EPCs, and we don't, the cost and the time frame, we just don't have the labour to go out and carry out all of the changes based on the current rules, to carry out all of the work that needs to be done in the time frame suggested. It's almost an impossible task. So again, let's see what comes of it. Okay, so what's become clear and evident is the fact that landlords are ultimately going to be put under more financial pressure. So the next step would be making sure that you've got a strong buffer for maintenance and voids. Obviously, with stronger tenant protection now and rolling tenancies, there's not necessarily more void periods, but also arrears. Might be a bit more difficult to get vacant possession of a property, and those void periods, void and arrears are two separate things, of course, but ultimately you may be carrying the can for a lot longer than you would normally until you can get that property vacant and re-let. So potentially longer turnaround times, and can your cash flow handle it? And then the maintenance side of things is bringing the standard of properties up to make sure that you're not at risk from a compliance perspective. So what is your experience of the landlords that you work with? How many of them actually carry a strong buffer for these types of things?
Honestly, not many. It's, it won't happen to me, my tenant's good as gold, etc., etc. But life changes, life is life, circumstances change and that sort of thing. Some lenders insist on you having it at application stage, so we can demonstrate it then, and you tick all the boxes and everything. But yeah, I can honestly say that smaller, and I'm referring probably more so to smaller landlords. My experience in the guys with bigger portfolios is they do tend to carry a bit more cash. They've probably had their fingers burnt in the process of growing the portfolio in the first place and realized, actually, I do need a degree of cash flow, surplus, working capital to cover these things. But the sort of 1 to 4 category of property owners, I'd argue, sit on very, very little cash.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's a focus to just bear in mind, is just to sit on a bit more cash. And I know people want to grow people who want to grow their portfolios are being aggressive, so they're using every last penny to put it down as a deposit. It's cash intensive, deposits, fees, solicitors fees, broker fees, valuations, etc. But you just got to be mindful that you've got to, the fines are huge for not being able to put those issues right, so and fix them quickly. So it's going to be key moving forward. And then the final point that we had to wanted to cover is just making sure that you are working with good professionals, and that your knowledge is kept up to date. So as these things kind of develop and the bill comes into force, making sure that you're taking advantage of all the resources out there, increasing your knowledge around the subject and what exactly the changes are, the dates as they become more apparent, keeping on top of it. And then just working with a good power team, working with a good agent who is on top of it and is managing, proactively and effectively, working with good solicitors, working with good brokers who can navigate the landscape with you. We are learning as we go along, and we're trying to pass on those learnings, via the podcast and various means, with, events and things. But you can never have too much. So we're always trying to keep on top of it and make sure that we're sharing anything that we get from the trade press and our internal CPD with our clients. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, just make sure you get your information from reliable sources. Facebook groups are probably not a reliable source. Haven't seen some of the threads and so on. I get it. They make great reading. When I'm sat there in the evening, they make me chuckle, and there are some valid points in there. But yeah, get it from trusted sources. The NRLA are a good source, specifically on the Renters Reform Bill. I know they've been heavily involved in campaigning and trying to influence this as much as they possibly can. So they would be a great resource as well for things like that. So yeah, don't do it because Dave down the pub said. I keep picking on Dave, but poor Dave down the pub, every time he says something, he gets a hammer in.
Nobody's in the pub with Dave anymore.
I know. I've told him no one to speak to him. So good old Dave down the pub. Yeah, just because he's done it doesn't mean it's right. Just get it from the proper sources to avoid yourself catching a cold.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, look, hopefully that has been valuable. And, as and when we get information through and this becomes more apparent as time goes on, then we'll try and share more of our experience and what we're getting from it. But yeah, hopefully that's been helpful, and speak soon. Thanks, Mark.
Cheers.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope you have learned something and have some tips to take away. We'd be very grateful if you enjoyed the show. You could give us a review and share with anyone that you know that may be interested. And of course, subscribe to the show so you can get notified when a new episode is released. If you'd like us to answer any questions or go deeper on a specific topic, please drop us a message at primeproperty.finance. See you on the next episode.